Good afternoon, or evening, or whatever it is. Okay, today we're going to be going through something that has, uh, it's not in the book. Um, it's about the liturgical calendar, and, well, generally speaking, it's about the liturgical calendar. Excuse me, more specifically, we're going to be talking about Easter, Christmas, why they're dated when they are, the role the Sabbath plays in all this, uh, and more. And I think it's this is some really interesting stuff. So, like for example, one of the things that you'll be able to answer after this is, why is it called Easter? That is a question that I not once had asked myself. Uh, even even after I had graduated with my bachelor's in theology, never even occurred to me to even wonder why. But we're going to find out why here. This is their excerpts taken, or this is like a presentation from bits and pieces of a book by Pope Benedict XVI called Spirit of the Liturgy. It's got to be, if it isn't my favorite theological work, it's tied for my favorite. It's really, really good. Okay, so I'm going to be asking you to follow along on the PowerPoint that I've posted. And also, if possible, you could pause it right now and print off these excerpts that I've also posted. Now, I know I'm asking you to do like 3 different things at once, and I apologize. If we were in the classroom, then it would just be 2 different things. Paying attention while paying attention to the PowerPoint that's on the projector and following along with the excerpts. Now, one word about the excerpts. They're in the order that I saw them in the book. They're not in the right order for this lecture. So we're going to be jumping around quite a bit. And I don't even think all of them will be quoted. Okay, so let's get going. So on to the second slide. First of all, what is the liturgy? The liturgy is a prayer. It's a prayer of the Church, moved and guided by the Holy Spirit, and a prayer in which Christ unceasingly becomes contemporary with us, entering into our lives. So by joining in the liturgy, by going to Mass, we're entering the prayer of the Church, and through that prayer, Christ unceasingly becomes part of our lives. So it brings us into a real and personal relationship with God. Next slide. Now, historical events form the foundation of the liturgy, of the Christian liturgy. So the liturgy isn't subject to our imagination or our will. It's not something made up, at least like consciously. But it has to do with actually historical events. So which events do you think would form the foundation of the liturgy? I'll give you a second. Okay, it's pretty much the birth, death, resurrection of Jesus, well, and probably ascension. So the Paschal Mystery. So next slide. Here's a lovely painting of the Nativity, so the birth of Jesus. Next slide, we got a painting, or actually might be an icon, I think it is an icon, of the crucifixion. Next, it's kind of hard to find a picture of the resurrection. Like, how do you have a picture of someone rising from the dead? So here's just a picture of a doorway. It looks like it's very bright on the other side of it. But on this note, read excerpt 7. Christ, the firstborn from the dead, takes death upon himself, and by his resurrection shatters death's power. Death no longer has the last word. The love of the Son proves to be stronger than death because it unites man with God's love, which is God's very being. Thus, in the resurrection of Christ, it is not just the destiny of an individual that is called to mind. He is now perpetually present because he lives and he gathers us up so that we may live. Next slide. The aim of the liturgy. Okay, so the aim of the liturgy is for our existence to become a living sacrifice united with the sacrifice of Christ. Okay, so we're called to offer our own lives up as a sacrifice, and that is united to Christ, or that is to be united with the sacrifice of Christ, and that is accomplished through the liturgy. So as this next quote says, the liturgy is a liturgy of a promise fulfilled, of a quest, the religious quest of human history reaching its goal. It is a liturgy on the way, a liturgy of a pilgrimage towards the transfiguration of the world, which will only take place when God is all in all. So this idea of the liturgy being a liturgy on the way, the liturgy of a pilgrimage, just tells us that the liturgy, like going to Mass, receiving the Eucharist, as amazing as those things are, that's not the end. That's not the goal. The goal is perfect union with God. And so that's where we get the idea of a liturgy of a pilgrimage, or a liturgy on the way. Next slide. Okay, now we're going to talk about liturgical year or calendar, however you want to call it. So hopefully, at least most of you use a planner. It's something I would recommend, especially the older you get, the more crap you have to do. So why would it be a good idea to have a planner? Well, it helps you organize your life, helps you to know what needs to be done and when it needs to be done. Liturgical calendar or year is not that different, which we will see soon. So next slide. The liturgy is enacted with a purpose. It has an aim. The transfiguration of not only men and women, but the whole cosmos, gathering us into communion with the Blessed Trinity. Everything is oriented towards this purpose. Now, first of all, this is just such a beautiful insight, that it's not only us on the way to transfiguration, but the whole cosmos, or all of creation. And I would say that, first of all, in the Byzantine and Orthodox traditions, this idea is more prominent. And also, they would refer to this idea of the transfiguration of us and all of creation as, they would call it theosis. It's like us becoming, lowercase g, gods. Okay, so thus with the liturgical calendar, with all the memorials, feasts, and solemnities, are there to help us not get lost in our pilgrimage toward the Lord. Okay, next slide. In the liturgical calendar, there is a daily rhythm and cycle, and there is also a weekly cycle, monthly cycle, and yearly cycle. Now, the smaller cycles or circles carry within themselves the great rhythm of the whole. So you have like the weekly cycle participates in the monthly cycle, which participates in the yearly cycle. Now, can you think of any examples of daily, weekly, monthly, or yearly cycles? They don't have to be relating to the church, but ideally so. Well, daily prayer, but not just prayer at any time. Like it's customary to pray at dawn and dusk, so sunrise and sunset. Weekly, you've got the Sabbath or the Lord's Day, so going to Mass on Sundays. Monthly, The only one I can think of that has to do with the liturgy is the Liturgy of the Hours, which is a 4-week cycle. It's like a 4-week prayer thing. I don't know if I went over that with any of you before, but yeah, it's good. But it could also be like dedicating a month like May to Mary. Yearly, we've got Advent, Christmas, Ordinary Time, Lent, Easter, Ordinary Time. So this is, that happens every single year. Now, before we change gears for a bit, I want to read parts of excerpt 16. So with regard to these cycles, so we're starting about a little bit less than halfway down. That is why the feasts of the saints from the earliest times have formed part of the Christian year. We have already encountered Mary, whose person is so closely interwoven with the mystery of Christ that the development of the Christmas cycle inevitably introduced a Marian note into the Church's year. The Marian dimension of the Christological feast was made visible. Then, in addition, come the commemorations of the apostles and martyrs, and finally, the memorials of saints of every century. One might say that the saints are, so to speak, new Christian constellations in which the richness of God's goodness is reflected. Their light, coming from God, enables us to know better the interior richness of God's great light, which we cannot comprehend in the refulgence of its glory. He's good. So refulgence is like brightness, I guess, I think. All right, now we're going to change gears a little bit. Next slide. The Old Testament and the Sabbath. So in the Old Testament account of creation, creation moves toward the Sabbath. Now, what is the Sabbath? What is special about the Sabbath? It's the day in which men, women, and the whole created order participate in God's rest or in God's freedom. The Sabbath is a vision of freedom, one where master and slave are equals. And keeping it holy means this: a rest from all relationships of subordination and a temporary relief from all burden of work. Now, the Sabbath within a Christian context ended up becoming known as the Lord's Day or the Day of the Resurrection, but we're going to talk more about that soon. Okay, next slide. Now, in the Old Testament, there was a double division of time. One division was determined by the weekly rhythm, which moved toward the Sabbath, and the other was that moved towards feast days, which are partly determined by creation, like harvest time would be a good example, and then partly by the remembrance of God's action in history. Now, it's important to recognize that the Sabbath brought the sign of the covenant into time and tied creation and covenant together. Now I'm going to read the first part of excerpt 10. At the same time, it's not about remembering a past and unrepeatable event, but as we have seen once for all, here becomes forever. The risen Lord lives and gives life. He lives and brings about communion. He lives and opens up the future. He lives and shows the way. But we must also not forget that this feast of salvation history, open as it is to the future, to what lies ahead, has its roots in a cosmic celebration, roots that it does not relinquish. Okay, we're going to stop there with that excerpt. Now on to the next slide. Oh, well, by the way, you got to think about the Sabbath within a Christian context. So, probably the holy days as well within a Christian context. So when we celebrate, technically every Sunday is a celebration of the resurrection. It's not just Easter. Now, Easter is like the great solemnity of it, but every single Sunday we celebrate the resurrection. And in Mass we say, like, the idea about this, this first line about, it's not about remembering a past and unrepeatable event, but as we have seen once for all, here becomes forever. So I think it's in the letter to the Hebrews where this idea of one sacrifice for all. And so it's not like when we celebrate the resurrection on Sundays and we celebrate Christ's self-sacrifice, that one event is not simply like remembered, it's actually enacted again and again. It's represented. Okay, now on to the next slide. So there's an amazing amount of continuity between the Old Testament and the New Testament, but not just, I don't just mean the New Testament, I also mean like right now, like in our celebration, in our traditions, in Christianity. So through the incarnation, cross, and resurrection, the covenant was raised to a new level. Now, as Grandpapa writes, God has acted once more in a new way, in order to give the covenant its universal breadth and definitive form. But this divine action had something to do with the rhythm of the week. Its climax toward everything else was ordered. Its climax toward which everything else was ordered was the resurrection of Jesus on the third day. Okay, now, before going to the next slide, it's pretty important to recognize that without the resurrection, there is no Christianity. Without the resurrection, there is no new covenant. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's all meaningless, but it kind of is. Like it would still maybe have some significance, but it's not going to be transformative without the resurrection. Next slide. But thankfully, Christ was resurrected. And with the resurrection, God is opening up what the Sabbath finds its fulfillment in. Thus, the day of the resurrection is the new Sabbath. It is the day on which the Lord comes among his own, inviting them into his glorification of the Father, and communicates himself to them. By the way, it's kind of, if any of you are getting at all lost, that's okay. It's difficult to, I think it's difficult to read through excerpts and have a sound understanding of what's being talked about. Like, I think it would be a lot easier if we were just reading the book together. But we can't, so just got to make do as it is. But like there are a lot of this stuff kind of builds up and builds into the greater insights that I want you to have. So don't get frustrated if you're not understanding something right now, because as we move forward, like we're going to get to the stuff that you will be able to understand, and I think you'll appreciate it. Okay, so next slide. So the day of the resurrection, aka Sunday. The transition from the Sabbath to the day of the resurrection as the sign of the new covenant reveals the transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament. As this happens, Sunday takes over the significance of the Sabbath. So the Sabbath for the Jews is celebrated, I think, on Saturday. Okay, so why do we now celebrate the Lord's Day on Sunday? That's going to be kind of one of the questions we're going to be answering here. Now, as we move forward, it's important for you to think historically here. It can be a challenge for us to grasp the meaning of all this, because we're talking about things that, well, I mean, they're so ingrained in our consciousness and daily lives that we take for granted that we go to Mass on Sunday. We don't really ask like why that is. All right, now buckle up because we're going to get some pretty sweet stuff. So first, the day of the resurrection. So there were are three different names for this day. Now, there's actually more names because it's the day of the resurrection, Sunday, the Lord's Day, and then these three. But these three are in reference to the rhythm of the week. Okay, so first we've got the third day, which is seen from the cross. So Christ was raised on the third day after from his crucifixion and death. Then you got the first day in terms of the weekly schedule. And the eighth day, which is seen in relation to the whole preceding week. The Church Fathers added that one. And I'm not going to get into the significance of that. And also the third day, that was regarded as the day of the theophany in the Old Testament. The day when God entered the world after the time of expectation. But the one that we're going to focus on that is the most relevant and perhaps important for us is the first day. Okay, next slide. In the Mediterranean world, the first day of the week was regarded as the day of the sun. And here Pope Benedict writes, "The Christian's day of worship was determined by the remembrance of God's action, the date of the resurrection. But now this date came to carry the same cosmic symbolism that also determined the Christian direction of prayer. The sun proclaims Christ. Cosmos and history together speak of him." Now, it's possible that some may object, thinking that that's just a coincidence, that you're reading way too far into this. To that, I would ask, well, okay, if God is not only the creator of the cosmos, but our creator as well, creating us, by his love and for love, for union with him, then wouldn't it make sense if the world, the place where we begin to learn about the Lord and love him and his love, were actually to lead us to him and speak of him to us? I mean, I think that makes perfect sense. May not be as strong of a response to the objection as you're looking for, but I don't know. Maybe I'll talk more about that later. So next slide. We've got a beautiful picture of a sunrise here, and while you're gazing at that, I'm going to read the 8th excerpt. "In the light of Easter, Christians see themselves as people who truly live. They have found their way out of an existence that is more death than life. They have discovered real life. Deliverance from death is at the same time deliverance from the captivity of individualism, from the prison of self, from the incapacity to love and make a gift of oneself." Next slide. So the East. Christians look toward the East, the rising sun. This is not a case of Christians worshiping the sun, but of the cosmos speaking of Christ. Next bullet point. This turning toward the East also signifies that cosmos and saving history belong together. The cosmos is praying with us. It too is waiting for redemption. It is precisely this cosmic dimension that is essential to Christian liturgy. Next slide. Furthermore, praying toward the East is a tradition that goes back to the beginning. It is a fundamental expression of the Christian synthesis of cosmos and history. Facing east means that when one prays, one is turned toward the rising sun, which has now become the subject of historical significance. It points to the paschal mystery of Jesus Christ, to his death and new rising. It points to the future of the world and the consummation of all history in the final coming of the Redeemer. So why is it called Easter? Why do we celebrate the solemnity of Christ's resurrection on a day that we call Easter, Easter Sunday, facing towards the east. And the rising sun is a symbol of the risen sun, using sun in two different ways. Next slide. Here's another picture of a sunrise. So I'm going to read the bottom part, close to the bottom half of 10. The sun of the first day becomes the messenger of Christ, who comes forth like a bridegroom leaving his chamber, and like a strong man runs its course with joy. That is why the calendar of the Christian feasts is not to be manipulated at will. The hour of Jesus makes its appearance again and again within the unity of cosmic and historical time. Through the feast, we enter into the rhythm of creation and into God's plan for human history. Next slide. So here's a picture of a monstrance. A monstrance is what holds the Eucharist during adoration. And what do you think that monstrance looks like? It looks like the sun. Next slide. Okay, so for Christians, this Sunday is time's proper measure. It is the temporal measure for our lives. It is not an arbitrary convention which could be exchanged. Rather, it is a unique synthesis of the remembrance of history, the recalling of creation, and the theology of hope, and is the weekly returning feast of the resurrection. Why do you think Sunday would be related to a theology of hope? Well, I mean, you could look at it from the historical perspective of, well, we're celebrating the resurrection, and that's the victory over sin and death. But you could also think about it like with focusing only on the rising sun. And this is really prevalent in Lord of the Rings. I think there's quite a few references toward it. But that, like when the sun is rising, you have a new day before you. Excuse me. Like you're embarking on an adventure. Who knows what that day is going to bring? All right, so let's start to look at Sunday with new eyes. Now, what Jewish feast did Christ's passion and death coincide with? Next slide, Passover. So what is Passover? What does it celebrate and remember? So it celebrates and remembers the Israelites being freed from Egypt, freed from slavery in Egypt. And Passover was the event. It's the last plague. And an angel of God comes by and kills every firstborn male, with the exception of the places that have lamb's blood sprinkled on the door. Now, what are the connections between Passover and Christ's crucifixion? Well, Jesus was the firstborn, and he's dying. And by his death, we're saved. So there's a clear connection there. Also, the lamb's blood, we refer to Christ as the lamb, and that's exactly why, because it's a reference to Passover. Okay, so next slide. The New Testament clearly shows that Jesus approached his hour with full awareness. It was not an accident. In other words, he knew what he was doing. And this is excerpt 1. Christ did not want to die on just any date. His death had a significance for history, for mankind, for the world. That is why it had to be woven into a very particular cosmic and historical hour. Like if you go back through the Gospels, at least the endings of them, I mean, you can see that Christ was very deliberate about, like he could have prolonged his stay, so to speak, before the crucifixion was going to happen. I mean, he basically told Judas the Last Supper, do what you're going to do. Kind of gave him a kick out the door to get him moving. So like it's clear that that Jesus was approaching this with full awareness of what was going on, and it certainly follows that he chose Passover for a reason, to die. So the connection with Christ's death and Passover reveals the universal significance of his death for human history. Next slide. Okay, so here's a picture of the constellation Aries. So it has recently been pointed out that the date of Passover, which is 14 Nisan, or Nisan, I have no idea how to pronounce it, coincides with the constellation Aries, which is symbolized by the ram. Now, what is important about this connection with what is important about this is its connection with the date of the death and resurrection of Christ. Now, before we go on to the next slide, I don't really know what 14 Nisan means, other than it's a month of the Jewish calendar, or at least Nisan is. I'm assuming 14 is the date. And for the second bullet point, we've already seen, I think, Christ's death and resurrection were inherently linked with the Jewish liturgical calendar. Okay, so now moving on to the next slide. How is the date of Easter decided? And by the way, we're probably going to tie all this stuff back together, or I'm planning on. Okay. So how is the date of Easter decided? It's always the first Sunday after the first full moon of spring. This was decided by the Council of Nicaea. So through its ruling, the solar and lunar calendars were interconnected, and the two great cosmic forms of ordering time were linked to each other in association with the history of Israel and the life of Jesus. Now, what led to that decision? Next slide. According to Scripture, Easter should fall in the first month. But the first month is not January, but the time when the sun, for the Jews at that time, but the time when the sun passes through the first part of the zodiac, which is the sign of Aries. So the constellation in the heavens seem to speak in advance and for all time of the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, the one who sums up in himself all the sacrifices of the innocent and gives them their meaning. Now, the full significance of this is soon going to become clear. Okay, so the Jewish tradition dated Abraham's sacrifice on the equivalent of March 25th, like what for us would be March 25th. Now, that date was also regarded as the first day of creation, the day when God said, "Let there be light." So if we look at Genesis chapter 1, like the very beginning. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, the earth was a formless wasteland. Darkness covered the abyss, while a mighty wind swept over the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw how good the light was. God then separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Thus evening came, and morning followed, the first day. Okay, so not only did March 25th, not only was that regarded as the first day of creation, it was also regarded, it was also celebrating Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, or would-be sacrifice of Isaac. And very early on, it was also considered as the day of Christ's death and eventually his conception. So next slide. So here we have a picture of Abraham about to sacrifice his son Isaac, but an angel behind him is telling him to stop, so he stops. So here we go with this quote from Benedict. The story of the ram caught in the thicket and taking the place of Isaac as the sacrifice decreed by God was seen as a prehistory of Christ. Okay, so while he wasn't really asking Abraham to sacrifice his only son, it was a test, but God actually does sacrifice his only son, or God the Father does actually sacrifice God the Son. So what he didn't actually want Abraham to do, he was willing to do. Then next slide. Also, the tree in which the ram was caught foreshadows the crucifixion. Okay, the cross is often referred to as a tree. And keep in mind the ram here, it takes the place of Isaac's death, or of Isaac. So in a way, the ram dies so that Isaac may live in a way. Similarly, Christ dies so that we may live. Next slide. These cosmic images enabled Christians to see in an unprecedented way the world-embracing meaning of Christ, and so to understand the grandeur of the hope inscribed in Christian faith. So that is, this is excerpt 5. And then he finishes it off by saying, "It seems clear to me that we have to recapture this cosmic vision if we want once again to understand and live Christianity in its full breadth." I just think that's a massively important point, something that we should take some time to reflect on. All right, next slide. Okay, we've talked about the symbolism of the sun. Now we're going to talk about the moon. So in the world of religion, the moon, with its alternating phases, is frequently seen as the symbol of the feminine, but especially as a symbol of transitoriness. And by the way, this is excerpt 6. The cosmic symbolism of the moon corresponds to the mystery of death and resurrection. Next slide. And when the date of Easter came to be the first Sunday after the first full moon of spring, the symbolism of the sun and moon were linked together. Transitoriness is taken up into what never passes away. Death becomes resurrection and passes into eternal life. So by celebrating Christ's resurrection, with the moon symbolizing resurrection, we face the east toward the rising sun. So they're brought together, made one in a way. Next slide. Okay, now we're going to get into an erroneous or false idea about Christmas. Some of you may have heard the idea that our celebration of Christmas was either borrowed from the cult of the sun or was in response to it. Excuse me. That's false. And in the following slides, we're going to see why. But before we do that, the cult of the sun, what they're talking about here is this huge pagan celebration of the winter equinox, or winter solstice, sorry. Winter solstice. And so some people thought that Christians celebrated Christmas so that they could disguise or kind of blend in with the pagans, so it wouldn't be like that kind of a culture shock or maybe even get persecuted. But yeah, it's possible that it's partly accurate, but there's so much more evidence pointing to the contrary, which we're going to get into. So next slide. Having been recognized as a focal point of faith in Christ, The incarnation had to be given some expression in the liturgical celebration, some place in the rhythm of sacred time, sacred time being the liturgical calendar. So Christmas assumed its definitive form in the 3rd century, and Christmas is the celebration of the birth of Christ as the dawning of the new light, the true sun of history. Now, I am skipping some things here, so you're probably right to be a little bit confused as to if you're looking for a fluid progression or a solid flow. That's probably it's not going to happen. But by the way, apparently the Feast of the Epiphany, which is January 6th, and that just so happens to be the birthday of your favorite teacher, this guy, appeared in the East around the same time or at the same time as the Feast of Christmas appeared in the West. Each feast had kind of a different emphasis, but their meaning was essentially the same. Now, guess what date Christmas was first celebrated? Next slide. Whoever guessed March 25th, you got it right. So the starting point for dating the birth of Jesus was March 25th. However, in a work calculating the date of Easter, written in the year 243 AD, obviously, we find first March 25th interpreted as the day of creation, and second, March 28th being the date for Christmas. So why would that be? Why would they move it back 3 days after March 25th, or 4 days if you count the 25th? Next slide. Here's why. In the creation story in Genesis, it was on the 4th day that God creates the sun. And in Jesus, we see the rising sun, or the rising of the true sun of history. So the true light of history. And if March 25th is held to be the first day of creation, the 4th day of creation would be the 28th. Next slide. That idea was altered later that century so that the day of Christ's passion and conception were identical. Therefore, we now celebrate the Annunciation on March 25th, and Christmas is moved to December 25th. So actually, when was it? I think it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, where it actually happened that we celebrated Good Friday on March 25th, which it's crazy. I was only able to go to part of a Byzantine liturgical celebration, but they actually celebrated them back to back. They celebrated what they call Great Friday and the conception, or the Annunciation, because that's what the conception of Jesus is, the Annunciation. So I'm pretty sure that's at least it's never going to happen again in my lifetime. Like, it's possible maybe for you. I don't know. At least I remember hearing that. So why would December 25th be the new date for Christmas? Next slide. Well, December 25th is 9 months after March 25th. And what typically lasts around 9 months? Pregnancy. So this is excerpt 13. Some mistakenly hold that celebrating Christmas on December 25th was developed in response to the Mithras, I don't know how to pronounce it, Mithras myth, or as a Christian response to the cult of the unconquered sun promoted by Roman emperors in their efforts to establish a new imperial religion. These old theories can no longer be held. Next slide. The decisive factor was the connection of creation and cross, of creation and Christ's conception. In light of the hour of Jesus, these dates brought the cosmos into the picture. The cosmos was now thought of as the pre-annunciation of Christ, the firstborn of creation. It is he of whom creation speaks, and it is by him that its mute message is deciphered. The cosmos finds its true meaning in the firstborn of all creation, who has now entered history. Next slide. From him comes the assurance that the adventure of creation, of a world with its own free existence distinct from God, does not end up in absurdity and tragedy, but, throughout all its calamities and upheavals, remains something positive. The fact that the dates of the Lord's conception and birth originally had a cosmic significance means that Christians can take on the challenge of the sun cult and incorporate it positively into the theology of the Christmas feast. So I think C.S. Lewis actually does a great job, especially in his space trilogy, of kind of doing this, or showing like how, or one of the things that he tries to show is that even in like something like Greek mythology or anything from any other religion or most other religions, like what's good in them finds their perfection in Christianity. And so he shows, I think he does a great job of showing like how that could be so. All right, next slide. So we've gone through a lot of deep content here, but it all has really practical applications. Like we should know now why we celebrate Christmas and Easter when we do, but there's a lot more to it than that. Like, so the surface level of what we learned is the reason why we celebrate Easter and Christmas when we do. But to go deeper than that, like we know that the liturgy, especially with regard to Christmas and Easter, isn't divorced from creation. Rather, creation as a whole, so that means including us, is meant to be transfigured. And now take a second to recall Christ's transfiguration. Like what happened there? You know, he leads Peter, James, and John up a mountain, and then his clothes and his countenance is just shining bright. And he's talking with Moses and Elijah. Like, so basically what happened is his divinity is visibly shining forth. So perhaps like on that occasion, we could say that there'd be no need for images or icons like as windows into heaven, seeing the invisible through the visible in that circumstance. And that's the goal of the liturgy, is to that's our destiny. That's what what I mean by that is it's what we have been sent to do. The goal of the liturgy is the transfiguration of not only us, but the entire cosmos. So before do you hear those freaking geese? I need to get myself a slingshot. As I'm talking about the beauty of creation, I'm getting upset about Canadian geese. I love the irony. Okay, so before I get to... yes, they flew away. Okay, before I get to that, I want to share one more excerpt. This is number 14. So the first part's a quote from St. Jerome, and then the second part is a quote from St. Augustine. Jerome says, "Even creation approves our preaching. The universe itself bears witness to the truth of our words. Up to this day, darkness decreases. The light advances, while the night retreats." And on that note, it's also significant to point out that the feast day of St. John the Baptist is June 24th, which is roughly the middle point, or pretty much the middle point, maybe a day before the middle, a day before the middle point of, or between Jesus' conception. Yeah, conception. Well, how am I forgetting this? No, it's the middle. Sorry, it's the middle point of the year. So, what happens around June 24th? You got the summer equinox, summer solstice. Sorry, summer solstice. And so, what is happening there? the light is starting to decrease. The days are getting shorter. And St. John the Baptist, he says, you must increase and I must decrease. And then around Christmas, or a little bit before Christmas, we've got the winter solstice. So that's light returning, the sun returning. And so there are, so kind of on that note, I encourage you to take time, especially during Lent, or this last week of Lent and Easter, to allow creation to speak to you of God. Now, we live in Ohio, and it's spring. So while on one hand that means it's still possible for it to snow, who knows, really? It's 77 today, or it was. And I think we've all been alive here long enough to see it change that drastically, from 77 to snow in not too much time at all. But it also means, that life is starting to show itself. So trees are budding. A few flowers, actually a decent amount of flowers are starting to blossom. I know the magnolia trees that are planted in my apartment area, those are blooming. Birds are returning from their winter migration. The light of the sun is feeling warmer, you can walk outside and actually inhale the fragrance of these flowers and trees and stuff. And while, as one who has allergies, I can sympathize with you if that doesn't get you excited. But let these things remind you of the resurrection. When you wake up in the morning, and well, granted, it is Ohio, so you may not see the sunrise, or there's a good chance you won't see the sunrise. When you can see the sunrise, take a second, let that remind you of Easter, of Christ rising from the dead. And so we can allow, by seeing these connections, it becomes a lot easier to see how much creation is actually involved with the liturgy, with this prayer of the church. When we studied icons, it was said, and this may not be true for the freshmen, I can't remember, but it was said that through the incarnation, creation has once again begun to speak of God. And so let it. During this quarantine time, take some walks outside. Enjoy the beauty. I'm starting to see a lot of fish, which is kind of exciting. I think I may have to get my fishing pole out. But I'm going to close with a quote from Grandpapa, which I think is pretty sweet. So this last slide. What is significant is this, that monotheism was not able to develop in the great cities and fertile countrysides of Mesopotamia. No, it was in the wilderness where heaven and earth face each other in stark solitude that monotheism was able to grow. In the homelessness of the wanderer, who does not deify places but has constantly to put his trust in the God who wanders with him. And that's excerpt number 2. So, close with just these brief words. I hope that this presentation is going to help you, or help make kind of the Mass and the liturgy more meaningful to you, along with making creation itself more meaningful to you. Actually, I think I forgot to bring this up earlier, but before Vatican II, even though nothing was said in Vatican II to make this change, most of the churches were built facing the east, okay? So when you would walk in the church, sit down, face the altar, and the priest would be facing the same way as you, not towards you, it was set up so everyone is standing facing east. and that's because of the rising sun. That's why it's called ad orientem. That's why the priest facing in the same direction as the people at Mass is called ad orientem, because that means to the east. And like that, just I think learning about all these connections with creation that the liturgy has, well, it was mind-blowing to me when I first learned about it, but hopefully it will help make the practice of Catholicism more concrete, more meaningful, and more significant with regards to everything for you. So with that said, have a great night, happy Easter, and I'll be praying for you.